Good afternoon, everyone. As you're joining, it's going to be just a few minutes before we get started with our webinar today. Thanks for joining us today, folks. We're going to have a few minutes before we get started, so get settled in and we'll be with you shortly. We're going to give folks about another minute and a half to trickle in before we officially get started with our webinar today. Okay, Audrey, are we still having people come in, or we slowed down just a little bit?
The trickle has slowed down, so I think whenever you're ready, you can get started.
Okay, let me just move one other thing around on my screen and we will get started for today. Happy Thursday, folks, or as I like to now call it, Junior Friday. Thank you so much for joining Great Old Broads for Wilderness for our webinar to talk about the National Old Growth Amendments. My name is Sarah Husby, and I am the Executive Director with Great Old Broads for Wilderness. Today, we have Audrey Glendenning, who is our Advocacy Manager for Great Old Broads, joining us to assist with the webinar, along with Len Montgomery and Josh Hicks, and I'll do more of a formal introduction of both of them in a moment. For those of you who are still learning about Great Old Broads for Wilderness, welcome. It is a pleasure to have you here with us today. Great Old Broads for Wilderness, we are a women-led national grassroots organization that engages and inspires activism to preserve and protect wilderness and wildlands. And we do that through 4 different ways, which is advocacy, education, stewardship, and fun. With the name like Great Old Broads for Wilderness, you have to have fun. We have 42 chapters, or broadbands, as we like to call them, that are volunteer-led by our broadband leaders in 18 states across the US, everywhere from the Northeast to Georgia to the West Coast and Alaska and everything in between, including the Midwest. So a big shout out to all of our broadband leaders who volunteer, and along with our staff and board who put in many countless hours to be able to bring you the great programming, and to all of our donors to help bring these programs to you. So we're going to hop right in. What is the National Old Growth Amendments? I'm going to do a quick little blurb and then introduce our 2 folks today who are the true experts on forests. Earlier this summer, the U.S. Forest Service released a draft of the highly anticipated National Old Growth Amendment, which aims to amend all management plans for all the units of the National Forest System across the country to conserve and steward old growth forests. As you can imagine, based on what I just said, that's some pretty heavy lifting that's going to be going on, and a lot of planning that needs to take place, and a lot of opportunity for you all to engage. This proposed amendment is intended to provide consistent direction to conserve and steward old growth forest conditions in response to a rapidly changing climate conditions. Today, we have Len Montgomery from Environment America, who is the director of the Public Lands Campaign. Len runs campaigns to protect America's most beautiful places, from local beachfronts to remote mountain peaks. She sits on the steering committee for the Arctic Defense Campaign and co-coordinates the Climate Forest Campaign. Len lives in Denver, where she likes to hike the wonderful Colorado mountains. We have Josh Hicks, who is the Director of Conservation Campaigns at the Wilderness Society. Originally from Memphis, Tennessee, Josh earned his master's degree in environmental law from Vermont Law School. When he's not working hard protecting the environment, Josh enjoys anything outdoors, playing music, screen printing, and skateboarding. So welcome, Josh, welcome, Len, and I'm going to turn this over to you all. One last piece of housekeeping before we get started for folks to know. You heard when you joined, we are recording this webinar, so it will be available to you all afterwards in a couple of days. And if you have any questions during the webinar, please put them into the Q&A, and we will be going through those towards the end of the presentation today and asking our experts to dial in and give you some responses to your questions. So thank you so much, Len and Josh. Take it away.
Sure. Thank you so much. So we're gonna do a little back and forth here. So I'm gonna start with some context about why we need a national policy for old growth, kind of where this fits into history, how we got to this point. Josh is gonna do some of the heavy lifting with explaining what the National Old Growth Amendment draft environmental impact statement says and doesn't say, and then we'll kick it back to me for a little speculation about what comes next. So I will go ahead and get started. So to introduce myself again, as Sarah said, I'm the Public Lands Campaign Director with Environment America and co-coordinator of the Climate Forest Campaign. Then I'm a professional forest campaigner. So the photo on the bottom is from the year 2000, and that's me working to collect petition signatures on the roadless for the roadless rule back in college. And then most recently is my most recent professional headshot. As you can tell, I haven't aged in the last 25 years at all. But why do we care about big old trees and forests? So this is always how I start. They're just the best. I don't have anything else to say, right? But there's actually a lot of reasons that that it matters that we're protecting our old growth and mature trees and forests. So one is wildlife. Forests across the globe are home and habitats for, thousands and thousands of species of wildlife, and there are species that particularly depend on old growth or older forests and older forest ecosystems. So the longer that a forest or a section of forest is undisturbed, the more time that it has to develop that full ecosystem, from the life happening in the overstory and the canopy to the developed understory that includes rich soil, down-felled trees, and critters living at all different levels. And I could talk about that for a long time because it's one of my favorite things about forests, is how amazingly beautiful and complex they are. But I will move on to clean water, an incredibly important value that we get from all of our national forests. But again, millions of Americans have their drinking water filtered through national forests, and the older, mature, and old growth undisturbed forests are, with their rich soil, are going to do an exceptional job of filtering water and helping make sure that animals and people have clean water to drink and to use. Bigger, older trees have absorbed and are storing tons and tons of carbon. And this is incredibly important as we're facing climate change. the idea that, we're also talking about spending billions of dollars trying to figure out carbon capture technology when it's literally standing in our forests right now. And then, of course, there's outdoor recreation. Americans across the country love to hike and camp and spend time in forests. And then my fifth reason is happiness. Studies studies show that trees actually make us happy. They actually make us feel calmer. It is a better experience to be able to be in the forest and in trees. So you can combine recreation and happiness if you want to, but these are kind of the big values and what we get from our old growth and mature trees and forests. So unfortunately, these forests and trees are being threatened. So there are 4 different threats that I sort of lumped under climate change. I'll say these things all exist and existed outside of climate change, but are being exacerbated by it. So drought conditions here in Colorado, where I am, and any of you that are in the Southwest, I'm sure are aware that we're in sort of a long-term historic drought condition that can threaten our forests, insects and invasive species, which because of climate change, may be more persistent diseases, and then wildfires. So, fire is natural. Wildfires have always been something that existed, but as I'm sure people are aware, current drought and climate conditions mean that fires are burning hotter and faster. That's also a result of decades, centuries of or over a century of mismanagement and fire suppression. This is not a fire webinar, so I'm not going to talk about that so much anymore, but these are all threats. And then the other threat is us. Well, probably not any of us. I don't think there may be some timber industry folks on this call, but likely not. But logging and specifically logging projects that are targeting old growth and future old growth that doesn't need to be removed. And I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but sort of where does this fit in the history of forest protection? So there have been, before the National Old Growth Amendment, kind of 2 big moments where the Forest Service made a decision to protect forests. And the first was the Northwest Forest Plan. So there's a typo on that. It should say 1980s to 1990s. It's not a backwards jump, but the so-called timber wars in the 1980s, where environmental activists in the Pacific Northwest were had identified that old growth was being logged, and did a lot of organizing and work to protect old growth. And ultimately, groups used the Endangered Species Act as a legal tool to work to stop logging of old growth forests in the Northwest. As a result of that organizing and outcry and organizing across the country, the Northwest Forest Plan was adopted in 1994 for 17 national forests. So that was about 24 million acres, and explicitly protected old growth, but only in those 17 forests. And then the roadless rule, which is where I cut my teeth on forest organizing, was actually not focused on old growth or mature trees, but was specifically about taking on the problem of the millions of miles of roads that were crisscrossing our national forests. And so in February of 1999, there was an 18-month moratorium put in place to temporarily stop road construction in inventoried roadless areas. So that's just a fancy word for the areas that the Forest Service had identified didn't have roads, or had roads that were no longer in use. The Clinton administration then started and completed a rulemaking process during which the environmental community collected and delivered 1.7 million public comments. That's what I was doing in that picture. And the thing I want to remind you all, there were not digital portals. Every single one of those comments was on a piece of paper. They were all delivered to President Clinton and to the U.S. Forest Service officials. And then in January of 2021, the roadless rule was enacted. And that protected nearly 60 million acres of national forests. So then the roadless rule was has had some back and forth, but is more or less held. But then in 2020, the Trump administration actually rolled back the roadless rule as it applied to the national or the Tongass National Forest, which is our largest national forest and the forest with the most old growth in the national forest system. And then President Biden reversed that exemption. And that's how we get to where we are now. So upon coming into office, President Biden indicated that he was interested in taking action on climate, that he was interested in protecting the Tongass and forests, and generally wanted to be protecting public land. And so the environmental community asked the Biden administration to take action to protect our mature and old growth trees and forests for the reasons that I covered at the beginning. A number of groups launched the Climate Forest campaign in February, and then this timeline is going to bring us up to Josh, Josh's section. But in 2022, President Biden issued an executive order directing federal agencies to inventory mature and old growth trees and forests on federal land and to develop policies to protect them. The Bureau of Land Management, which is not what this call is about, but got into the action. They manage some forests. And the following year, the mature and old growth inventory was released. So the Forest Service did some, kind of initial work to figure out where all of the mature and old growth was. They also put out an advance notice of proposed rulemaking to get feedback. That was last summer. We all, including many broadbands, helped deliver more than 500,000 public comments asking them to take action. So in December, they put out a notice of intent that they plan to develop a national old growth amendment. And then here we are today, most of the way through the 90-day comment period on the National Old Growth Amendment. So I'm going to stop talking and turn it over to Josh, who's going to do a little bit of a dive for us into what does the National Old Growth Amendment say, what does it not say, and we'll go from there.
Thanks, Lynn. All right, you can go to the next slide. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to start with some broad contours of what's in this draft environmental impact statement. And then what I'm going to do on my next slide is get into kind of the details of the agency's preferred approach, their preferred alternative, and kind of the shortcomings with it, primarily is where I'm going to focus. And then on the last slide of my section, we're going to get into kind of some suggestions of where might be a good place to focus feedback to the Forest Service. So broad strokes first. First off, as Sarah alluded to and Lynn did to, a nationwide old growth amendment. This is precedent setting. The Forest Service, nor really the BLM, has ever done kind of a nationwide amendment to all of its federal land management plans in one fell swoop. There's been kind of programmatic level amendments that might cover many of these types of federal plans, but nothing that kind of covers kind of all relevant forest plans or federal land management plans. So this sets precedent. Another mechanism to do this could have been like a rulemaking, like the roadless rule that Lynn pointed out. The administration decided that a nationwide forest plan amendment is their preferred approach. I don't know how many of you are familiar with forest plans and kind of how they're constructed. I'm going to spend just a minute or two on that because it's going to be important because I'm going to kind of end up tearing back to this information I'm about to deliver for kind of the rest of my presentation. So with a forest plan, what you have is what the agency calls plan components. And these components in a forest plans are things like a desired condition statement. And think of a desired condition as like the North Star. You could have objectives in a forest plan that's sort of like measurable benchmarks or milestones that the agency intends to hit on its way towards achieving that desired condition. So within 5 years, forest plans last about 15 to 20 years. So within 5 years or 10 years, we're going to make this kind of progress towards achieving that desired condition statement. You have standards, which are the thing that most folks in kind of the environmental conservation community are most eager to see in forest plans, which is kind of where the real restrictions come from on development. So take, for example, if an agency recommends wilderness, the Forest Service recommends an area for wilderness in a forest plan, they may have a standard that says no mechanized use, no motorized use can occur in recommended wilderness areas. So that would be like a standard. And then a guideline is kind of like a soft standard. So it's still something that the agency will follow, but instead of oftentimes like no motorized use will be allowed, no motorized use shall be allowed, it's more something like motorized use shouldn't be allowed in like a recommended wilderness area. So, and then management approaches, there's other plan components too, but I'm going to refer back to these plan components in a minute because it's important and kind of how they've designed this old growth amendment. So broad contours here, what you have is 4 alternatives. You have 3 of these are what the agency considers action alternatives. And if you're familiar with like a draft EIS, what these things do is they lay out kind of oftentimes the preferred approach as well as kind of various other approaches. And then they analyze the environmental impacts of each one of these kind of various alternatives. And as many of you probably know, this process doesn't dictate an outcome. It only dictates that the agency kind of understand what it's doing and analyze the impacts, or look before you leap, as some people like to say. But it doesn't dictate the most kind of protective approach. So you can see here, for those of you who kind of have your computer open, you can see the screen, what these alternatives do. I'll quickly run through them in case some of you are on your cell phone. Alternative 1, it's the no action, meaning take no action. Alternative 2, that's the one that the Forest Service has said is their preferred approach. It's pretty complex, which I'll be getting into in the next slide. Alternative 3 is what the agency is kind of labeling as more restrictive than alternative 2. The primary thrust of alternative 3 that makes it more restrictive is there's a standard that says no commercial exchange. I'm paraphrasing here. No commercial exchange of basically material that's removed from the land when conducting treatments in old growth. And then alternative 4 is less restrictive than alternatives 2 and 3. There are no standards. So what I'd say about the primary difference between the action alternatives is the standards. Alternative 2 has 4. Alternative 3 has this 1 that's pretty restrictive, and alternative 4 has no standards. All of the alternatives, their action alternatives, have the same plan components otherwise. So remember that desired condition statement explanation that I offered. All of them share that same set of desired condition statements, the objectives, as well as manage these management approaches, which is what I'll get into again on the next slide. So again, the major fault line between all these alternatives is the standards. And then there's the environmental impacts analysis. And as you can imagine, for those of you engaged on an individual forest plan revision process, they can get pretty detailed. They're also sometimes kind of generic. Well, think about a nationwide environmental impact statement that's intended to address all the different forest types that are out there, which there are many. So understandably, the environmental impacts analysis is pretty coarse, pretty generic. That's not necessarily a bad thing. It can be done well. What I'd say, though, is this one is not done very well. It's not all that informative, which I'll get into again in a minute. So that's just sort of the broad contours with minimal editorializing, but I'm about to get into some editorializing kind of next. So Lynn, do you want to take us to the next slide? So the preferred alternative, this is where I'm going to take a little bit of a deeper dive. I could say a lot here, but really as you can see, I've kind of pointed out three things that I'm really going to hone into up top, and then, well, more than three, but just a handful of things here. So one, the way this is really constructed is there is direction for existing old growth. So basically where we already have old growth. And then that will go into effect immediately upon the decision getting signed that will put forth conservation direction for this existing old growth that we have. And then currently it puts forth a process, so not direction, but more like a process for recruitment for future old growth, i.e. mature forests. There are no protections for mature forests, but again, there is a process for recruiting more old growth among mature forests. So simply put, kind of break it out, two buckets: direction for existing old growth, a process for recruitment. Let's get into existing old growth first. So what you have here are just a few of the shortcomings with this existing direction for old growth. And I feel like what I've highlighted here, like I said, I could go on and on. These are some of the most important things that I feel like if the agency could tighten up, it would make the most meaningful strides towards turning this from what it is to something that could be much better. There's exceptions. What does that mean? So when you have these standards in place, you can't do this. Basically, exception is you can't do this unless, X, Y, or Z. The exceptions that they've created to the standards in this preferred alternative, they're really broad. Take, for example, there's this standard 2B. I'm not sure how much you guys have had a chance to take a look at it. My guess is probably not much. That reads, the only thing that standard 2A is the only type of activity that can happen in old growth is proactive stewardship to make old growth forests retain or enhance their old growth characteristics. And then proactive stewardship is things like vegetation management. But in many places, vegetation management is indeed needed in old growth stands because it's threatened by wildfire, but not all the time, which we'll get into in kind of one of the next concerns, like moist forest types. So standard 2B includes an exception that says, well, we don't have to comply with that proactive stewardship standard if we take or remove trees for other incidental activities that happen on the forest, which means an incidental activities could be if they're building a trail, expanding a ski lift, doing oil and gas development, putting in roads, all of that, they could cut down trees because that's incidental to the management that they want to do, which basically makes old growth conservation subordinate to the other multiple uses that are happening out there, which defeats the whole purpose of what this amendment is about. So the exception in standard 2B is a problem, to say the least. Standard 2C also has several exceptions, as though standard 2B's exception wasn't bad enough. Not all of the exceptions in standard 2C are bad. There's 6 of them. Many of them are about public health and safety. That's not a bad thing. There's one in there about cultural uses. So you can take old growth trees for totem poles or canoes. That's what that's about. At the Wilderness Society, we're okay with that. But when you have standard 2C and exceptions for things like, oh, by the way, this doesn't need to apply wherever the Forest Service thinks it shouldn't apply for various forest types, which is basically how exception 6 reads in standard 2C. That's a problem because that's basically another get out of jail free card for the Forest Service. And then there's another exception bear with me here. Told you I was going to be taking a deep dive about de minimis community uses. This is one that we are really kind of also taking issue with and would like to see knocked out. And this is kind of exception number 4 under standard 2C. It's so you know, if you end up writing comments, be careful here. You don't want to say, take my words and say, eliminate the exception 4, because what the agency has done is they've combined that exception number 4, which is that cultural use one, with community, de minimis community uses. And we like half of that exception, but not the other half. And so that's just another example where I think some fine tweaking here, some very fine using a scalpel could really help make some improvements here. That's enough on exceptions. Let me move on. That was pretty dense. Here's another thing about this amendment is it's very much about kind of intervention and proactive stewardship is what the agencies have called it. That's not necessarily a bad thing to have proactive stewardship or intervention, particularly in dry forest types, where, as Lynn alluded to, there's been a century of fire suppression. And now you have dense, smaller, younger trees growing in that really are threatening the larger trees. And so doing appropriate vegetation work to reduce some of those fuel loads among the younger trees that are threatening the older trees. The Wilderness Society, we're okay with that. However, that type of work shouldn't happen necessarily everywhere. There are like moist forest types. Take the southeast or the northwest, or the west side of the Northwest, those coastal forests of the Tongass. They often don't need to be doing intervention. Indeed, kind of restraint and passive stewardship to let the forests naturally regenerate might be the best approach. But there's not a lot of real estate in this EIS. Moreover, within the plan components themselves, that creates space for kind of restraint and passive stewardship. And so we would like to see that on equal footing with proactive stewardship and intervention, because they are both appropriate tools. And then the last thing that I'll mention here, the third thing is, so we done exceptions, passive stewardship, and lastly, a concept called non-degradation. When the Forest Service scoped on this project back in December through February, they had a pretty good standard in there that said basically old growth conditions shall not be degraded. Well, they got rid of it in the draft EIS. They said it was redundant with some of the other plan components, and we definitely disagree with that. And I feel like that if we could get that non-degradation standard back in there, it would create some important guardrails, particularly where we're doing that kind of proactive stewardship, i.e. intervention, to make sure that it's the right kind and it's the kind that's not degrading old growth conditions. So asking that non-degradation standard for old growth be reinstated would be an important guardrail. So those are 3 things that I'm going to point out. I could probably point out another 15, but I feel like those are the ones that if we could really tighten these up, it would go a long way. Now that's all for existing old growth, right? Let's get into recruitment. Let's get into mature. So like I said, there are no protections for mature in this. The Forest Service has created this for among any of the alternatives, to be clear. The Forest Service has has basically said it's premature. We don't know enough. We understand that's what the executive order says. So they've limited kind of the scope of this process to focus on existing old growth and the recruitment for future old growth without including direction for mature. The recruitment issue lives in what they call management approaches, and the agency is requiring in these management approaches the development of something called adaptive strategies for old growth forest conservation. And in development of these adaptive strategies, for short, every unit's supposed to develop one collaboratively and, among other things, identify priority areas for recruitment for future old growth. And it goes on and on. There's a lot of there's a big footprint in this amendment and these management approaches and what it should look like to go about recruitment. But that's what the recruitment issue looks like. I think there's some concern. The agency has given itself 2 years to do this. That doesn't seem feasible to the Wilderness Society to do that in 2 years. So either they need to broaden that out and expand that timeline and really invest and take this seriously, or if they don't, we could end up with a bunch of these adaptive strategies that are meaningless. So which is it? So that's kind of a little bit deeper of a dive of what's in the preferred and the concerns with it. And Lynn, next slide. So this is where I would focus on where should you focus your comments. Here's my suggestion. This is just my suggestion. The impacts analysis, honestly, don't waste your time. It's terrible. I would say hold your nose. I mean, clearly you can kind of give them a lecture, a policy lecture if you want. But I would say if you find yourself commenting on this thing, don't spend your time picking out flaws on page 31 and 42 and 130 and 462. Like, this thing is littered with flaws and inappropriate assumptions. If you want to offer kind of a policy lecture, go for it. But I think but don't get into the weeds is my recommendation. I don't think it's worth the time. I do think what's worth your time is getting into the plan components, which I'll get into in a second. I talked about alternative 2 and I talked about alternative 3. So remember, alternative 2 is the preferred. Alternative 3 is kind of the more restrictive alternative. You know, when you're commenting on this, you all can decide where you'd like to focus your time. At the Wilderness Society, we're going to be focusing on, since alternative 2 is the preferred, and that's the direction that the agency sees itself going, focusing on offering kind of surgical improvements in the way that I kind of alluded to on how that one can be improved to try and get that one across the finish line to be as best as it can, since that's the direction this seems to be heading. But that's just a strategy call from the Wilderness Society. Others should feel free to, you know, weigh in however they see fit. And so in terms of focusing on those plan components and how to fix those standards, how to fix those desired conditions, that in my calculus is probably time better spent than, you know, poking holes in their impacts analysis. Now, if this was the Trump administration and we were trying to build a litigation record and we needed to really poke holes in the quality of their impacts analysis, that might be a different play. So that's kind of where I would suggest focusing comments. And then here's where I would kind of, again, suggestions to focus on: demanding a roadmap for recruitment for future old growth, reinstating that non-degradation standard, higher billing for passive management and restraint on equal footing with intervention and proactive stewardship, and then commenting that those exceptions are too broad, particularly, you know, in the ways that I kind of alluded to. So that's what's in this thing, broad and narrow. And then those are my suggestions for where might be a good time to focus your time. And Lynn, I'm going to turn it back over to you now.
Great. So I'm just going to talk very briefly about what happens after September 20th. Though I'll say my my entire last 90 days have just been focused on September 20th. So I'm not really sure what happens in the world after that. Okay, but what's next? So there's sort of 3 phases. I'm not going to get into post-election speculation, but just to tell you a little bit about some of the conversations that we've been having. So first is September 21st, after we've submitted our comments through November 5th-ish. The big thing here is even after the comment period is over, our organizations are going to keep advocating. This is when the Forest Service will be reading all of the comments, taking all the feedback that they've gotten and developing that final environmental impact statement. We're not just gonna, go underground and be quiet. We're gonna continue to, offer suggestions, continue to keep the steady drumbeat of support for real protection for old growth, going forward. And then the, post-election through January 19th, which is basically the end of Biden's presidency, and then January 20th and beyond, depends on the scenarios. And again, I'm not going to game these out, but just to say there's kind of 3 different things that we're looking at. So first is if Harris wins. Second is if Trump wins, but the Democrats can stop congressional attacks on things that have been put into place. And then the third scenario is if Trump wins and Congress can, pretty much pass and roll back whatever they want. So until we know what happens in November and we know which of those scenarios, there's whether we're on what sort of defense or offense we're playing will be a little bit, it's still a little bit up in the air. But the biggest thing between now and November, and really between now and January, is to continue our work to reinforce that the Biden administration has an opportunity to develop a really strong national old growth amendment to take this once in a generation opportunity. And it's, we've given them the feedback. They know what we want, and to make sure that, that we continue to focus on that. So that's what I've got for what happens after this. And I'm going to stop sharing our slides and let Sarah or Audrey tell us what's next.
No worries. I'll share with the group on what's going on. So first, thank you, Len and Josh, for all of that very important information and the deep dive into the National Forest Amendment. As someone who has read many, many pages of this, I still feel like I learn every time I talk to somebody else, because there's just so much information in there. And it's really been great seeing the conservation community come together, working on this, dissecting it in different ways, and sharing information as we all come to our own conclusions as, organizations on the positions that we're going to be taking as we advocate for the best possible National Forest Amendment. So if you all have questions, please put them into the question typey area on your Zoom. I'm not sure, there's probably an official name for Q&A. I'm making up my own right now. We already have a couple questions to get us started. So I'm going to throw the first one out there, and, Len and Josh, I'm going to let you guys kind of tackle it as you feel appropriate. Can one of you please define what treatments in old growth is?
You could run the gamut from stuff that's not good to stuff that is. So a good treatment in an old growth stand, not all old growth is healthy, right? Some old growth can be healthy, and meaning like it has the conditions that you're looking for. In other situations, particularly where there's been fire exclusion and you have overly dense amounts of trees that are in there because of that history of mismanagement, treatments could look like the removal of some of those younger trees that, should a fire start, it could result in climbing up and serving as ladder fuels that could kill kind of the larger, older trees. So a good treatment in old growth would be something that kind of brings ecological integrity to what otherwise might be kind of an unhealthy stand of old growth. So targeting kind of those smaller, younger trees.
Len, is there anything you want to add about treatment in old growth?
No, I think, I said no, but yes, let me. I agree with what Josh said, and I think we're, Environment America and Wilderness Society are on the same page, where we are concerned that the current draft of the old growth amendment gives a little bit too much leeway for that we both think that removing smaller trees in old growth stands can be necessary And we at least are concerned about, removing old growth trees that don't need to be removed. So it's important to have guardrails on what those what is the treatment supposed to be doing, and then what's necessary. And I think that's a big thing that everyone is looking for in the old growth amendment, is good guardrails that make sure that the Forest Service is doing what, they say that they're doing in these scenarios.
Great, thank you. So what is the Forest Service definition of old growth and of mature?
I'm laughing because there are a lot of documents about this. So and I'll let Josh answer too. So the forest, well, I guess not just the Forest Service. Old growth is a condition rather than a specific, like, this tree is 200 years old or whatever. So when we're looking at old growth, and when the Forest Service is looking at old growth, they're looking at conditions of the forest that include, everything from the average age and the diameter and the different species and the overstory and the understory and how everything is developed. And so it's it ecologically, it's a pretty complicated thing because it really depends on the ecosystem and the elevation and the amount of moisture and all of that. So the Forest Service came up in their definitions and in inventory, very complicated and complex definitions for old growth and mature that depend on forest type. I'll say the Forest Service uses both. Some forests and then some regions have definitions that are a little bit more coarse, that are about, age and diameter and that sort of thing. But again, you have to look, sort of forest plan or region by region to understand that. And again, they're usually talking about not individual trees that are old growth, but conditions that would make a stand or a part of the forest old growth. But Josh, I don't know if you want to jump in on.
Yeah, that was great. The only thing I might offer is old growth is considered kind of the last stage of forest development. The mature phase is the stage before old growth development. And there is, as Lynn was kind of getting at, there is no like age, like 80 years is a mature tree, or 120 years is an old growth tree. Like, it varies depending on the forest type. Sometimes it runs really old until a forest type can reach old growth phase. Sometimes it's pretty young, like loblolly pine in the southeast is only a few decades, but it could be well over 100 years for another forest type. And so mature forest, it's the same. There's no one specific age, so it just depends on the forest type that you're talking about.
Okay, thank you. Are Indigenous groups in agreement or supporting the perspectives of, your two different organizations, or how are Indigenous tribes being engaged in this process with the Forest Service with the Old Growth Amendment?
Sure, I can speak to this a little bit. So, well, Indigenous groups are obviously not a monolith. Things that I'm aware of, there have been two resolutions passed by ATNI and NCAI, which are groups of tribal governments, both calling for the Forest Service to protect mature and old growth trees and forests. I also know that a number of tribes and indigenous voices, specifically in Southeast Alaska, have weighed in with concerns about how and whether the National Old Growth Amendment will protect the Tongass National Forest, which is in Southeast Alaska. So that's their home and ancestral homeland, and is also the forest with the most old growth. And as I don't know that I've read every single of their comments, but that's all been generally on the same, same page and same perspective that we are. And then I'll say the Forest Service has, separate from the way that they've been engaging with organizations like the Wilderness Society, Great Old Broads, and Environment America also have a separate tribal engagement process, as I think they're in fact required to. And that's not something that we've been party to, obviously, because that's directly between the tribes and the agency.
Thank you. Okay, so the next question we have for you, actually, it's for Josh, but Len, you're more than welcome to weigh in also. Josh, could you please talk a bit more about what we can say in the DEIS comments regarding passive management? So open it up that to both of you. What more can we say about passive management?
Yeah, what I'd say is if you're like a real practitioner in this stuff and a real wonk when it comes to forest policy, what you can do is focus on the definition for proactive stewardship and asking that it be broadened to include passive management. I think there are within the some of the standards that really seem to emphasize intervention, asking that some of those specific places where intervention is really coming up in the most meaningful way, again, which is those standards, I think emphasizing that restraint is also important. But if you're not a wonk, and you're not like a technical policy, legal expert, I don't get hung up on that. I mean, I would just say, write your comment in a way that maybe is just kind of like, say what you mean. Like, this is all about active management and intervention, but where's the passive stewardship, in this thing that is very much appropriate in moist temperate forest types. So there's a couple of ways to do it and just kind of probably address it that matches your level of expertise.
And I think I'll just quickly say a tension that I think we have with the Forest Service is that they see their job. I mean, it is their job to manage the forests, but sometimes that means just don't do anything. And it is, I think, challenging for the agency that is an agency of people that are used to doing things. And we're saying, look, for some parts of some forests, just you don't need to do anything. Just leave it all standing there. So that'd be a kind of very plain English way to say, just include that in your plans going forward. Plan to do nothing.
Thank you for that, both of you. The old growth amendment for the Northwest Forest, so the Northwest Forest Plan has been delayed until October. Do you have any clues on how this amendment may be the same or as different as the national old growth amendment? So kind of how are they intertwined? How are they going to bounce off of each other, since we have that's a lot of forests to include in the Northwest Forest Plan that's going to be affected by this old growth amendment?
The interplay between these has been a source of massive confusion, I think. So they're fundamentally, it's two different processes, both of which will ultimately amend the forest plans, of the forest, or will amend the Northwest Forest Plan. And as I understand it, the Forest Service will default to the most protective standard. So if there's a forest plan that already says, you can't log any old growth, I don't know any of them say that quite that coarsely, but for example, the national old growth amendment might be weaker than that. You default to the strongest thing. So I think, a very kind of basic way to think about this is that they can't undermine each other. But it is, the fact that they're doing them simultaneously is certainly a little can be a little bit confusing, especially for those of you in the Pacific Northwest who are trying to engage directly with the agency and, understand what it is that they're considering for which one. But that's what I've got.
The one thing that I might add is given that they're not in sync with each other, this will go into effect in theory before the Northwest Forest Plan Amendment does. So this will apply until that alongside the current direction in that Northwest Forest Plan. And then when that Northwest Forest Plan Amendment gets finished, which does touch on old growth, that will then come down on top of this amendment. And then when you get into, you kind of have to crosswalk the two sets of directives. And it's what Len said, which is kind of the more protective approaches will kind of rule the day. And my guess is that what's going to come out of the Northwest Forest Plan, I hope and would envision that that would probably be more protective than what you're seeing here in the National Old Growth Amendment. And so the whatever gets kind of worked out and decided in part of that Northwest Forest Plan Amendment will be what's in place.
Thank you. I have one final question that I'm going to kind of pose and then do a little wrap up for folks. Where should letters or comments be sent to be the most effective? What's the best way to, maximize our comments and thoughts in this process?
Well, one plug is submit comments through the portal that Great Old Broads has set up. But then if you're going to write your own, you should submit them, that are a little bit longer. You should submit them directly into the Forest Service CARA system before 11:59 p.m. Eastern on the 20th. And I'll say the CARA the Forest Service on the back end will be analyzing everything that comes in through the CARA system. And so that's truly the best way to get your stuff in.
And I saw Josh, you dropped that in there. Thank you.
Yeah, I sent it to just you guys though. Here, that's to everybody. That's the CARA. That's what when Lynn says CARA, CARA, that's the Forest Service.
Yeah, sorry, the which stands for, it's an acronym within an acronym, but it's basically the portal through which to submit comments.
Great. Thank you, Len and Josh. So just a kind of few things to wrap up for today. We will be sending out to you all who registered and participated a copy of the recording today, along with the slides for you all to be able to kind of go back and reference. Great Old Broads for Wilderness also has our own petition that you all can sign, supporting the position that Broads is taking with the National Old Growth Amendment. And so that information is going to be up on our website shortly, and expect an email from us in the next couple of days. There are many resources out there also on the web for many of our great conservation partners. You have probably been receiving many emails from those groups because you are so passionate about the environment. I know you are signed up for many of the different listservs. So please, as Josh had said, and also as Len has said, do your homework, look at the different alternatives that works well for you. There are many places you can go to get some resources, and know at Great Old Broads for Wilderness, we are here to help and provide resources for you. But again, if you don't want to sit down and write 12 pages of comments, that's okay. We have a letter that we can have you sign that we will be submitting before the 11:59 deadline, probably a day before. So better safe than sorry, because you never know what's going to happen with the government website with everyone bombarding at the last minute. The Broads petition will be for individuals, but if broadbands also would like to sign on, that is an option. Audrey will follow up with our direct broadband leaders on what next steps are for you all. And one other question in there from Kenneth before we sign off, which is what entities or resources will be involved in deciding treatments?
And I think Josh has just gone off camera to go coach a soccer game. So that'll be the foresters, so the folks at the Forest Service that manage the individual forests will, as part of the normal course of their job, identify areas that they think require some sort of treatment, and a treatment might be thinning, it might be clear cutting, it might be prescribed burn, it might be, it's a number of things, and then they then contract with entities that can, perform those services. And typically there's some, if you're active locally, in your forest district, there's, it'll be posted, the plans, and there's often opportunities for the public to comment and that sort of thing. But that happens on a very, very local level.
Yeah, thanks, Len, for adding that. So this actually is the next phase in 2025. So we are not just, well, I would say one and done, but this is, we're not just two and done. There's phase 3 still to happen, which is this local work on the forest that the Forest Service is saying it's going to take 2 years, where you all are going to have this opportunity really to dive in to help shape what this means specifically for your forest with these treatments. And please keep an eye out for future webinars from Great Old Broads Wilderness on how we can support you all for that, how you will be able to find that information. We will be doing something next year on how to use the federal registry, how to get notifications so you are not forgetting when these important dates are going to be coming up. With that, I am going to say thank you to Len, thank you to Josh, who has already hopped off. Thank you to Audrey and everyone who has been here today to listen, to learn more about the National Forest Amendment. Your voice is important in this process. It is a public process. Do not be stifled. Make sure to please get out there, use your words, say how important our old growth is, say how important mature forests are, and they need to be protected also, and what we want to see with that into the future. Have a wonderful evening, and thank you so much for joining us. Good night.